Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing sort of a curation of some of my favorite palettes, indie eyeshadow palettes for fall, because I know that we're not technically in fall. Technically fall starts on September 22nd on the autumnal equinox, but I feel like a lot of people, myself included, consider, September 1st the start of fall. Like that's when all of the pumpkin spice products start hitting the shelves and stuff like that. And it very much is not fall weather where I live, but I am hoping to manifest some fall vibes through these palettes. And I hope it goes without saying that you don't have to use any of these in the fall, and you can obviously use all of these outside of the fall season. For myself, I do tend to crave seasonal tones as we approach the season, but also halfway through the season is when I start getting a little sick of them, and I'm like, okay, let me bring in some other things. But right now I do find myself gravitating towards some of these fall tones, so I want to show you some of my favorite palettes. I also feel like these types of seasonal videos or just palette roundup videos are such a fun way to both talk about some newer fall releases while also incorporating older palettes in my collection, just making sure that they get some attention and love. Pulling them back out seasonally really helps me do that. Quick disclaimer before we get into the bulk of the video: a lot of these palettes were sent to me in PR. A few of them were purchased though, so I will make sure to note which ones were which as we go along, as well as in the description box, along with any codes that I have with these brands in case you are interested in the palettes. Last thing, I did include a few discontinued palettes. This one up top is actually discontinued, that's why I have it up here. But sometimes, I debate whether I want to or not include discontinued, but at the end of the day, these videos are not meant to make you feel like you need to go out and buy any of these palettes. And I know that a lot of us have really large collections, including quite a few discontinued palettes. So I do think that there is value in including those palettes in videos like this, so that people who are maybe on a no buy and maybe can't get any of the newer palettes don't have FOMO for those and can feel excited about stuff that they already have in their collection, and that includes discontinued palettes. So the first palette I have here is Nomad's Hudson Valley palette, and I did already mention that this has been discontinued, but this is genuinely one of my favorite fall palettes, and now it's extra sentimental to me because I just came back from the latest Creators and Friends trip that was in Hudson Valley. Actually, it was up in the Catskills, and we went a little too early to enjoy any of these fall changing colors, but it was still a really beautiful time, and I feel like I wish I had taken this palette with me. And this palette is also sentimental to me even before I even went on this trip, because this was my first Nomad palette ever, and I actually purchased this myself because I just completely fell in love with this color story. As you can see here, this is kind of a classic fall color story in my eyes. You have a bunch of warm tones on this side that are ultimate stereotypical fall tones. But I think what especially caught my eye about this palette is when I first got into indie makeup, warm tones were my jam, and I wasn't so much a cool tone person. And obviously, if you know me at all, that has changed a lot in the last couple of years. But this palette did push me out of my comfort zone. It forced me to look at some of these cool tones. And this column right here actually has become one of my favorite columns. This kind of muted cool tone green gray shades is just one of my all-time favorite tones to wear. I feel like it just is so pretty on my complexion, and I don't know, this palette really started my love affair with this kind of color. I will say that the shimmers in this palette are pretty untouched. I think I've swatched them a couple of times, but I've never worn them because I've said before that the shimmer formula in Nomad's older palettes is just not my jam. They're not sparkly enough for me, and sometimes I will use them for a shade cascade, which is just my term for layering shimmer. So sometimes I will use less sparkly shimmers like this as a base for more special topper shimmers, but I don't know, none of these tones really spoke to me, so I never reached for the shimmers in here. But the mattes, I'm a big fan of these mattes. Nomad did recently bring back 3 of their older palettes for an anniversary special, and they mentioned that they might bring back more with updated formulas. So this is a palette that I would love to see brought back with their updated shimmer formula, because then Oh my gosh, this would probably be in like one of like my all-time favorite Nomad palettes. This is another older Nomad palette. This is Ghost Town USA, and this is also a special Nomad palette for me because this was the first one they ever sent me in PR, and I was ecstatic to receive it because, like I said, I was starting to kind of like dip into cool tones, and as you can see, this is quite a cool toned color story. So if you are someone who is looking for fall tones but just like you don't jive with warm tones, this might be a palette to look into. I feel like the colors in here are so special because they're cool tone, but they're a little desaturated, which I feel like is very at odds with what we typically see in fall palettes. We typically see warm tones and jewel tones. And I feel like this palette does not have that, at least in the mattes. A couple of the shimmers might be a little bit more jewel toned, but again, the shimmers in this palette are not my favorite. I do think that they are a step up from the ones in Hudson Valley. These have a bit more sparkle and shine, but the formula in here, a couple of these are a bit like squishy, like overly emollient, and just like not my favorite formula on the lids. They don't really crease on me, but I've heard that they crease in other people, so I would tread with caution with these shimmers. But even despite that, I still feel like this palette is so good and definitely high up in like my favorite palettes from Nomad. Like the fact that I reached into this palette just for the mattes says so much. I really like the layout of the mattes. I like that we have like a light shade, a mid-tone shade, and a deepening up shade in each of the columns. I will say that in this column over here, I feel like these two browns are just like a little too similar. You see what I mean? Like I wish that this brown in the middle was like more halfway between these two, and same with like this column over here. I feel like these are quite deep, and you know, like you're not going to get like a ton of depth difference between the two, but I also feel like with this column, like these shades are a natural progression from this light one up here. The last palette from Nomad that I want to talk about is their current fall release. This just came out a few weeks ago. This is Witch City Salem, and this is what I would consider kind of a classic Halloween color story. And I'll be honest, this is not like my ideal kind of color story. When I first got this, I was a little confused. I was like, how am I going to use this palette? How am I going to combine all these colors together? Because I just feel like it's really all over the place, and there are a lot of really bright and deep tones without like a ton of midtones that go with them to blend into. Like I feel like a lot of the midtones are these like two gray shades over here, which like, I don't know, like with like these really like saturated, like the red, this like plummy shade, this purple. I was like, what do I blend those out with? But the more I sat with this color story, the more I could envision different color combos. And when I did a look with this palette, I really love how it turned out. It pushed me out of my comfort zone, and I feel like that's typically when I'm forced to get creative and I end up doing looks that I really love. And now that I've sat with the palette, my only critique with it is that I wish we didn't have two gray shades. I wish one of these had been replaced with like a lighter or mid-toned pink, purple, red, or something to go with like these tones over here, because I just feel like it's a little hard to like to blend out these shades without anything else. And I will say, I think I saw someone do a look using this matte over here, and it blended out beautifully on its own, but I know that not everyone is comfortable doing that, and since it is such a deep shade, I just wish that there was something else in this palette to pair with it. The last thing I want to point out is that Nomad really has improved their shimmers so much over the last year, I would say, and the shimmers in these palette are no joke. Like this silver shade up here is so gorgeous. Let me swatch it for you. It is so sparkly and beautiful, and just like something that I myself as a sparkle goblin would love to use. Same with this like olivey green shimmer over here. So beautiful. Like these two shimmers are such standouts for me in this palette. And the other ones too are not like super lacking in sparkle. They aren't as sparkly as these two over here, but they have enough to kind of satisfy my needs, and I am comfortable using them as like a base shimmer in a shade cascade. Next up, I'm going to be talking about some palettes from Glaminatrix, and I don't think I mentioned in the intro, but these are in no particular order. Like I'm not ranking these palettes or anything, but I am grouping them if I have multiple palettes from a brand. I'm going to talk about all of them together. And this one was their current fall release again from this year, and this is like a quintessential fall palette in my opinion, because look at these tones. It is so gorgeous, and you have like all the colors that you would have in a bonfire in this palette. I do have a dedicated video covering this palette that goes much more in depth on everything, so I won't spend too much time talking about like that kind of stuff, but I do want to point out that the size of the pans in this palette are different from their other recent palettes that have mini pans. These are standard 26mm pans, and the palette is magnetic, so you can take these out. I also want to note that the formula in this palette is a little different from their other palettes with the mini pans. The mattes here are more pigmented and not as like foolproof blendable in my opinion. They feel more like a pressed pigment than like a easy to blend eyeshadow. But the quality is still really good. Like I didn't have any huge issues with the matte. I did feel like the mattes like spread a little bit easier than their old palettes, but that's what I meant by like they're not as like effortlessly blendable as the previous ones. They're just a bit more like, you need to have a little bit of experience with indie eyeshadows in my opinion to use this palette, as opposed to their other ones, which I feel like are more beginner friendly. For me, the standouts in this palette are the shimmers, hands down. Like the mattes are not my favorite formula, but these shimmers are so freaking stunning, and you have such a good range of tone, depth, texture, all of that. Because like these two over here are a little bit more like darker base multichromes. I guess this one's not like super dark, but the red one is, but they're like very smooth and very metallic and high shine. And then this one over here is a bit more textured. It has like a bit of a taupey base, and it's really good for topper, like as a topper shadow, but also as a standalone shade. It's so stunning. This one over here is more of like a duochrome because it doesn't really shift, but it has that like slightly orangey base with a gold shimmer on top. This one over here is an iridescent, and this one doesn't really shift either, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, it doesn't really shift, but it is a really pretty gold iridescent. And then this one over here took me by surprise because it at first seems like your typical like variation of a blue-brown type of eyeshadow, but I swear to God, this is like one of the most sparkly, beautiful versions of the shadow that I own, and I have been very excited to wear this all over my lid in a look this fall. I cannot wait to use this. This is another palette from Glaminatrix. This is their Tones of Turd palette, which initially started as an April Fool's Day joke and then turned into this beautiful color story over here. And if you are not into poop-themed humor, they do have an alternate version of this palette called Grounded that has more of like a serene theming, exact same color story, but just more normal names. Now, this palette did sell out, and they initially said that they were not going to be restocking it, but as I'm filming this video, I happened to check Instagram and I just saw that they will be bringing this back mid-October. So if you missed out on this and you really wanted it, you will have another chance to pick it up. Now, even though this palette was an April Fool's Day joke and wasn't intended to be a fall palette, I do feel like this color story is kind of perfect for fall. It has a lot of those yummy, warm fall tones, and I almost think of this as like an alternate fall palette to Bonfire, because this has some overlapping warm tones, but like there's no proper orange in this palette, and I know a lot of people are like orange haters. They don't like using orange mattes or shimmers. So if those stuck out to you in Bonfire as like unappealing, then maybe you would like this palette instead. And really quickly, here are the two palettes side by side. You can see this really bright orange jumps out at you, and I feel like the red even in this palette is like brighter and more saturated. There isn't a true red in this palette. There's just like a warm reddish leaning brown tone, and overall this just feels more like muted. And this palette actually does have a couple of cool tones in here, which this palette doesn't. Now, similarly to Bonfire, Tones of Turd / Grounded does have the larger, or rather regular size 26mm pans and is magnetic, and the matte formula is the same as in Bonfire, so it's a bit more of that like pressed pigment-esque formula that is going to like give you like so much pigment off the bat that you do need to be a bit careful if you are a build and blend girly like myself. But I really did not have any issues working with this palette. I quite enjoyed the matte formula. And the shimmers in here are so special, and some of them are really unique to my collection, particularly this one over here and this one. But I will say the textures of the shimmers in this palette are a bit like flakier. They're not like super flaky, but compared to Bonfire and some of their other palettes that are in the smaller pan sizes, these have a bit more texture to them, a bit more extra emollients to them, and the trade-off is that they are more like impactful. They're also a bit more delicate and loosely pressed though, so I would keep that in mind when you are using this palette. Like, don't just go in with it roughly the way you would with some of their smaller pan sizes. Like, you just need to be a bit more careful, but like, look at these shimmers. They are so gorgeous, so shifty. This one over here is like a type of shimmer that I already have, but it's one of my favorite types of shimmers because it's just like, look at how shifty that is. That is wild, but it can pick up all of the shifts just right here. And they're so sparkly and impactful. I feel like I want this level of sparkle and shine, but in the other smaller pan formula that's a bit more stable and not as emollient. But I did not have any issues with these creasing on me, but if you do, I just want to note that. My last palette from Glaminatrix is one that I've talked about plenty of times already on my channel. This is their Barely Basic palette, and this to me is more of like a spicy neutral type of palette, but very much in fall tones. And this is the type of formula that I love to see from Glaminatrix. These mattes are pigmented but very blendable and very beginner friendly in my opinion. Like, I don't have any issues with like over blending or like, you know, getting a scary amount of pigment right off the bat. And the shimmers are very impactful and very sparkly without being emollient or too textured or fragile or anything like that. I feel like I've talked about this palette so much in the past, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but the things that I don't love about this palette are just like some of these like mid-tones are a little too close in color. Like, these two greens are a little too close, and I feel like with this row, I wish this like burnt orange shade went a little bit darker to distinguish it from this one over here, you know, that kind of thing. I wish that this shade wasn't like so light because it's basically like useless for me. But aside from that, I really love the assortment of matte tones. I love that we have a column. All of them are very distinct and separate. I love that we typically have, you know, this gradient of like light to deep to make blending very easily. And these are just like my perfect type of neutral adjacent tones when I want to like sneak in some color into a look but still have it be a little bit wearable. And then with the shimmers, I really love that we have this row of iridescence up here, and all of them are different tones. Like, this one over here is more of a cool tone pink. This one over here is more of like a warm orangey tone. This one over here is more like greenish, and then this one over here is more like gold. So you do have separate and distinct tones, and all of them are really quite shifty as well. These make really good inner corner shades or all over the lid. And if you're like me and you love layering sheer shimmers over mattes, I feel like you can get so many different combos layering any of these over any of these mattes. And then I really love this row of shimmers over here too, all really highly impactful. This one over here is kind of just like a standard metallic but incredibly high shine and reflective. Same thing with this shimmer over here, very beautiful. This one over here is like a proper shifty multichrome, I think. Yeah, it goes all the way from this like reddish to orange to greenish shade over here, and this one over here has like some dimensional sparkles in it. So I don't know if you'll be able to really see, but it has these like blue specks amongst that like pale olivey green, and just I think each and every one of these shimmers is so beautiful, and they're all distinct and different, and they really complete this palette. I think this is one of Glaminatrix's best palettes they've ever made. And if you're someone who kind of wants to dip into fall tones, but you're not the biggest fan of like bright, punchy, colorful tones, then I feel like this subdued but still warm toned palette would be perfect for you. Now I'm going to talk about a couple palettes from Bella Beaute Bar, which is one of my favorite indie brands, but I do want to let you guys know, in case you haven't heard, I have a collab with them now. So obviously I am incredibly biased when it comes to this brand, but a little bit in my defense, I did love this brand for a long time before they ever approached me to collab. So my love for their products is genuine. It just comes with a bit of bias. This is their Poison Garden palette, which was one of their fall releases last year. Every year, I feel like the brand does two releases. They do a fall release and a Halloween release because I know that the owner is just like a big fan of this time of year. So this year, the fall release was my palette, and they started teasing what their next release will be, but it will be their Halloween release. But this was their fall release last year, and this might be one of my favorite palettes from the brand ever, barring my own palette, of course. This has all of those muted, grungy, yummy tones that I just adore, and the palette is like a good mix between cool tones and warm tones. I'm so sorry, I used this palette recently and I was dipping between another shade, so that had a little bit of red pigment in it, but it's a proper like deep, dark, murky burgundy, and I just feel like this is kind of a grungy rainbow palette almost. I feel like this kind of goes hand in hand with the Glaminatrix palette in that it has a lot of more like approachable muted colors. It is a lot more colorful than Barely Basic, which like Barely Basic I would categorize as a spicy neutral palette, but this I would categorize as more of like a palette that maybe people who wear more neutral tones would find approachable if they want to dip their toes into color, if that makes sense. The palette does lean a bit more mid-tone and darker overall. There aren't a lot of lighter mattes in this palette, so this is definitely for like the grungy, murky lovers, which I am. And even the shimmers, like a lot of them are like a bit on the darker side. Like the bases are quite deep and dark, especially when you move away from the light. I feel like as far as like the lighter shimmers in this palette, it's really only this one up here and maybe this one over here. Like those have like slightly more like mid-tone bases, but all of the shimmers in this palette are just like so pretty. If you know Bella Beaute Bar, you know that their shimmers go hard and their matte formula is really wonderful. So this is definitely one of those palettes that I recommend from the brand if you're trying them for the first time, because I feel like it just really represents what the brand is all about, which is beautiful mattes in beautiful tones and beautiful shimmers as well. The one thing I don't love about this palette, and this is just personal preference of course, but there is a sequin matte over here. This is actually a black with some blue sparkles in it. I don't know like how well, I think you can see it here when I bring my finger up to the camera and it's a bit out of focus, and I just don't really have like a ton of use for sequin mattes because I feel like the sparkles fall out. They give you a lot of fallout. I don't really like black mattes to start with, so this shade is essentially useless for me, but this palette is magnetic, so like if I wanted to, I could swap this out or just like not use it, because this is quite a large palette. So in such a large palette, if I'm not able to use one shade, it's not the end of the world. And again, I am a little biased, but I almost think of Poison Garden as kind of like the warm toned sister to my own palette, Coalescence, because Coalescence leans a lot more cool tone and it has a lot of these like muted tones with like a few neutrals, and this palette to me is like the warm tone sister to it with like the muted colorful tones as well as a couple like neutral colors. I just feel like they pair really well together. Now this is also from Bella Beaute Bar. It's the recently Deinfluenced palette, and this was the Halloween release 2 years ago, and I think that this palette is for people who want more brighter, punchier colors, because Poison Garden is, like I said, a bit more subdued and murky, and this one does have like some deeper tones, but they're much more like jewel tone and vibrant. You have some warmer tones up here, you have some iridescence, so if you prefer lighter shimmers, you might like this palette a little bit better. I just feel like this is such a cool and fun color story for fall. And even though this is a bit of an older palette, I don't find it to be like lacking in quality in any way. I feel like with some other brands, some of their older palettes of shimmers are not as impactful, but I feel like Bella Beaute Bar has always had really beautiful shimmers, and this palette is no exception. In fact, this shimmer over here, Digital Zombie, is probably my favorite version of this type of like ultraviolet blue shifting iridescent. It is so punchy, so impactful, and it actually has like a decent amount of sparkle to it, which is very hard to do with this type of shade. This shimmer over here, Backlash, is also super special. It's gorgeous. It has a lot of sparkle and shine to it, a beautiful shift to it, and it also has like an ultra fine hollow to it. I will say that Bella Beaute Bar has improved their hollow formula a lot from this era. Like I feel like the hollow in here is not the most visible. It's very subtle, but in their newer palettes, the hollow is a lot more visible and impactful. I will say if there is like one kind of like critique for this palette, it would be that these two shimmers, like we have a lot of these warm orangey reddish tones, and I just wish there was like a little bit more variation here. But aside from that, this is such a gorgeous palette that I think has stood the test of time. Moving on to a couple of Blend Bunny palettes. This is the All Done Up palette, which is one of my favorites from the brand. I included this in my recent like neutral palette roundup because I do consider this kind of like a spicy neutral palette, and I put it in the same category as Glaminatrix's Barely Basic because I feel like it kind of walks the line between true neutral and spicy neutral with like a couple pops of color that are a bit more on the wearable side. And at the same time, I feel like this is mostly like a warm tone palette with a couple of cool tones over here, and overall this screams autumn to me. I do use this palette year round, but I feel like these tones are like your typical classic fall tones. I am a personal fan of the gradient Blend Bunny layout. I love that you have light, mid-tone, and deep, and the deep shades truly do go super, super deep and dark, which I really, really value because I love adding depth in my look. I love using things like these as, or tones like these as liners. I think that's dog hair over there, whoops. And the mid-tones over here are really beautiful. I do feel like these light shades are like a little too light for me, for my skin tone. I don't usually use these on their own. I usually mix them with the shade down. But if you have a lighter complexion or you just enjoy using lighter tones to blend out with, then you will probably get a lot of use out of this row as well. I also feel like this palette was where Blend Bunny really started to level up their shimmers. I feel like these are so, so beautiful. Like if I just swatch a couple of these, like even without swatching, I think you can see how like beautiful and sparkly they are, but they have a really fine particle size. So if you don't like super textured flaky shimmers, I think you'll really like this formula. And they're not emollient or creasy or like oily or squishy at all. I feel like this is a really, really lovely formula. My critique with this palette is I feel like these two shades could have been a bit more different. Like I would have loved for this to be more truly like olive tone and not as like gold, because I don't feel like there's a huge difference between these two. And this shimmer over here, I feel like it has a pink base, but it reflects mostly silver. So when I swatch it out on my skin tone, that pink doesn't really come through, and it's a little similar to like the silver topper shade over here. And so I just wish that this was more like pink or orange or something, in that like there was just more variety in the shimmers. That's like the only drawback in this palette, in my opinion. My next palette from Blend Bunny is not strictly a fall release. This was actually released earlier this year. This is the Beauty Below palette, but I actually feel like this color story is perfect for fall, especially if you like deeper, richer, more jewel tone shades. This palette is full of a gorgeous assortment of coordinating like mid-tones and deeper jewel tones in like blue, pink, purple, this like seafoam green, and then like this olivey shade and like some neutral tones over here. I just feel like this is my kind of ideal mid-tone, deep tone palette without any light shades that are useless for me. Something I really appreciate about Blend Bunny is that they are never lacking in depth in their palettes. I find that a lot of palettes just don't go deep enough for me. There just are never enough deepening up mattes, and I love that Blend Bunny is not afraid to give us multiple deepening up options that aren't just a straight black matte, because I am not actually a fan of black mattes in my palettes. I don't like them to deepen up with because I find that they can get out of control really easily. I only really use black mattes as liners, and I don't really need that many of them. But in this palette there is one black matte, and then there are a ton of like deepening up tones, and they are actually really different. On camera they may not look that different, but when you swatch them out they are different. In fact, here they are swatched out. So this is the true black matte, and these are a little sheer, but you can see they all have their own distinct color to them. And quite honestly, when I am working with dark mattes like this, I typically am pairing them with lighter tones. Like if I were to use this matte over here, I would be probably using it with this shade over here. And when you start blending them into this, those undertones come out even more, and they don't appear just as a black matte or just like a indistinguishable dark matte, I guess. This is also, I think, one of the only Blend Bunny palettes that has like an equal amount of shimmers to mattes. I know Plastic also has equal shimmers and mattes, but it's a lot smaller than this. And Blend Bunny has leveled up their shimmer formula over the years. I don't feel like this is quite on par as the shimmer formula in All Done Up, because a couple of these are a bit like smushy, squishy, emollient, and not as sparkly as those shimmers, but there are several shimmers in this palette that I do really, really enjoy. This one over here, Lull and Slay, is so, so pretty and sparkly. This one over here is so vibrant and gorgeous, and this one over here, Immerse, is super sparkly and stunning as well. I feel like Some of the shimmers in here I enjoy, and other ones I probably wouldn't touch. And another thing that I want to point out is that there are quite a few darker shimmers in this palette, which does go with the theme and the overall color story of the palette. But if you are not a fan of darker shimmers, there are several of them in this palette, so I just want to point that out. Next up, I have a palette from Wicked Widow Beauty. This was their Halloween release, I think last year. It is the Tales of Terror, a Haunting palette, and to me, this is a quintessential Halloween color story because I think a lot of us associate orange, purple, and green with Halloween, like the secondary colors, and that is exactly what this palette is full of. I love so many things about this palette. I love the assortment of mattes. I love that there are not a ton of lighter tones, which I've mentioned countless times that I don't really use. I love that there is kind of like an almost even number of mattes to shimmers, and the shimmers in this palette range from like true multi-chromes to some duochromes to even I think a couple more like standard shimmers. So if you're not a fan of just like all special shimmers, all multi-chromes in your palettes, this might be a better fit for you. And I will say even like the standard shimmers in this palette are very special and sparkly. I feel like this one up here, it's very shiny and very sparkly, even though it's just like a regular shimmer. And even the duochromes, like this one over here is like very glowy. It's not super sparkly, but it has an intense glow to it, and it is like a blue reflect on that purple base, so it kind of has like, it gives you a pop of contrast amongst all of these like similar tones. I will say, even though I am not the biggest fan of lighter mattes and I appreciate having a lot of depth in my palette, I do think like a couple of drawbacks in this palette, in my opinion, are both of the purple tones are on the darker side, so I would have loved to see one of these a bit more mid-toned, and then both of the green mattes are pretty close in tone and depth. So again, I would have loved to see one of these a bit lighter or one of them a bit darker, just to like set them apart more and give you more like versatility in this palette. But this palette is actually magnetic, so you could swap out one of the shades if you really wanted to. There are also a couple more neutral tones in this palette. These two mattes over here are neutral colors, and then these two shimmers are really neutral. And this one over here is so stunning and sparkly and beautiful. Like all over the eye, this makes for such a gorgeous chocolatey brown smoky eye with a little bit of something extra, like there's a little bit of rosiness in the reflect and it shifts to more of like a goldish shade. It's just such a special shimmer. Next up is Dieverune's Witch of the Wildflower, which was, I think, technically a fall release, but I wanted to include this for people who like brighter tones in the fall. If you don't like all of those like muted, murky, grungy, subdued tones, I feel like this palette still screams fall to me, but has like really nice bright pops of color. This palette actually somewhat reminds me of Bella Beaute Bar's Basic Witch palette. There is some like overlapping tones, but for whatever reason, I don't really think of Basic Witch as a fall time palette, even though it technically was released in the fall. For whatever reason, I see that as more of like a spring palette. It just feels like brighter and like punchier to me, I guess, with like the pinks and those really bright purples. But the tones in this palette to me speak to me as a bit more like fall tones, especially these ones up here, the deepening shades over here. And I feel like even these tones over here, they have like, you know, some pop to them, but they're not as bright and as pastel as the shades in Basic Witch. And so I just feel like this is like a nice option if you do want some more like colorful tones in the fall time. This is a more matte heavy palette. There's only one row of shimmers over here, and I will say I much prefer the matte shades in this palette than the shimmers. There's nothing wrong with the quality. They're very sparkly and beautiful, but I feel like I have a couple of drawbacks to the shimmers in this palette. This one over here is probably my least favorite because it's just like not as special as the other ones. It's not super shifty or anything. It is really sparkly, but the other drawback to me with this palette is a lot of the shimmers are more like green orange heavy, and there's this one over here, and yeah, green orange, and there's one over here that has like a purple base, but again, it reflects more green with a little bit of those red specks. So I just wish that like there was a bit more variety in the shimmers, because even the split pan over here in the middle, it's an iridescent, but this half of the iridescent is green and this half is orange. So I feel like there should have been like either like a proper pink shimmer or a purple shimmer in here just to complement those tones over here, and that would have made it a truly perfect palette to me, because I feel like the struggle with smaller palettes is you can't really always coax out like a large variety of looks, and the mattes here are not lacking in that way. There's so much versatility over here while still being cohesive, but the shimmers I feel like could have used a bit more variety. This is a palette from Fantasy Cosmetica. This is their Enchanted Autumn palette, so very on theme, and this was a collab with Amanda from Makeup Just for Fun, so I don't know if this palette is still around, but I adore this palette, and I feel like it is a little slept on. I feel like this is another one of those palettes that I wouldn't call it a neutral palette, but it's one of those like approachable, colorful palettes if you maybe only wear neutrals. I just feel like these subdued, murky, muted tones are so easy to wear and perfect for autumn. If I recall correctly, Amanda designed this palette to be very much like you could pair like one shimmer with one matte and get a lot of like easy looks in that way, but there are also like, it's very like coordinated. You have like your pinky gray tones over here, you have some like murky green tones over here, this row all goes together. Like, it's laid out so thoughtfully and the colors were so well curated. This is very much in line with my preferences. Like, I love like purple, pink, green palettes essentially. I feel like that was kind of like the basis for Coalescence, my collab palette, but this feels like even more muted, even and also like a little less cool toned, I would say, because there are quite a few like warmer leaning mattes over here. But this grayish lavender matte over here is one of my all-time favorites. It looks very like neutral gray in the pan, but when I swatch it, do you see that purple peeking out from it? It is so stunning. I love it. I will say the shimmers in this palette are not overall my favorites, because like for my preferences, I wish that some of these were more sparkly, more special, more shifty. This silver shimmer over here, Libra, is extremely sparkly and beautiful, probably the most sparkly shade in the palette, but the rest of them are not necessarily ones that I reach for, but I do enjoy dipping into this palette for the mattes. And if you are the type of person who just prefers more like regular kinds of shimmers or not super like glittery, flaky texture type of shimmers, then you will probably enjoy these shimmers. Next up is a palette from a Sea Beauty brand. This is the brand Narimi, and this is their Deadwood palette, which has this beautiful color story. Like, I think you can sense the theme in my favorites. I love a muted, murky, kind of grungy color story, and I believe this palette is no longer available because Narimi does very like limited drops, limited stocks of her palettes, but they're all so special and beautiful. And I don't know if I've ever talked about Narimi on my channel before, but I really enjoy her formulas, her color stories, her palettes. I have 3 of them as of now. I do want to buy more, but I've been on an eyeshadow no-buy this year, so I just have not picked up any, but I may be ending that no-buy or breaking that no-buy soon, because there are a couple palettes from her of late that I really want to pick up. But this one is definitely currently my favorite palette from her. Her matte formula, if you've never tried it before, is extremely powdery, like super powdery. When you dip your brush in there, no matter how lightly you tap it in, there's going to be a ton of kick up. But some formulas that have that I find are hard to work with, but hers are not. They're like pigmented but easy to blend. They're not like a scary amount of pigment. They build well on top of each other, as well as like mixing with each other. And I really like the matte selection in this palette. I feel like you can get like a lot of different looks out of such a small palette, because there are only 8 shades here, and it is a matte heavy palette, but the shimmers are really pretty too. And I do find that the shimmers in her palettes can vary in quality and texture and all of that, but the ones in here are really pretty, really sparkly, just really gorgeous. I almost double dipped my finger there, but like, look at that. Such stunning shades. And I feel like you have tones that kind of fit all the different colors in this palette. Like, there's a good assortment here. You have one that's like really dark and purpley, one that's a bit more golden warm, and then like a neutral shade over here, which, by the way, this shade is a dupe for JD Glow's Unexpected, which I feel like is a legendary shade that you can no longer get your hands on. And even while the brand was still around, a lot of us, myself included, stopped supporting them because of some views that they had that I did not support. And so I was really happy to find this shade as an alternative to that one. Moving on to the only palette from Glamlite in this video. I feel like the cover's kind of hard to see, but this is from their Twilight Breaking Dawn Part 1 collection. This is the Jacob palette, and this is a proper neutral palette to me. Like, there are a couple of green shimmers here and this green matte, but aside from that, like, it is fully neutrals, but it gives me fall vibes. And if you are someone who wants to get in on those like fall feels, but you only wear neutrals, and if you don't want to spend a lot of money, but you still want really special sparkly shimmers, this is the palette for you. I feel like Twilight on its own already, like the franchise, a lot of people associate it with fall, myself included. I just feel like it's the perfect fall comfort watch. And this palette, I think, like, I wouldn't say it encapsulates the movies because it is the Jacob palette, so it's very like wolf themed and like earthy and like fur colors, you know, like wolf fur colors. But like that does make for like a beautiful neutral palette. And I have talked about this palette before on my channel several times, so I apologize if I'm a broken record, but I feel like the quality of the mattes, the quality of the shimmers here are that really good Glamlite quality. The shimmers are very sparkly without being too textured, without being overly emollient or squishy. There's like a good variety in tone, in depth, in texture, and same with the mattes. I will say, again, I've said this before, but like the drawback of this palette to me is that a couple of these like more warmer neutral shades are a little too similar. I wish we had gotten like maybe a different kind of cool tone or just like something different to round out the palette a bit. But aside from that, this is such a beautiful palette and definitely one of my top recommendations from Glamlite, especially if you like neutrals. I have one palette from Cosmic Brushes, or Cosmic Beauty is their new name, I think. This is the Undergrowth palette, which is not new for them, but it is new to me in my collection. They recently sent this to me along with their Smolder palette, and I just feel like these tones are so perfect for fall. You have these like beautiful murky green tones, and then down here you have warmer tones, and together like this just screams fall. Leaves changing from green to like the warm tones. It is such a stunning palette. I'm so glad I finally have this in my collection. Like I said, this is pretty new to me, and since it's not a new release, I haven't like done any like dedicated content with it. I have used this palette once. I want to use it some more. I really like the assortment of matte shades in this palette, but I will say I remember when this palette was first revealed or was first being teased, I was hoping that there would be more green shimmers in this palette because there are quite a few green and green leaning mattes, but a lot of the shimmers are more like neutral gold warm tones, and there are really only like a couple of true green shimmers. And even this one over here, it's more like orangey straight on, and it only shifts to a green at an angle. And so I do find myself wanting for more green shimmers in this palette, but because Cosmic Brushes is so affordable, like I really don't mind pairing their palettes with some of like single shadows or just like other palettes with more special shimmers to like supplement the palette. And even then, none of these shimmers are lacking. Like I don't think that they like are not special. They're all really sparkly and really pretty. There just aren't as many like special shades. There are more like standard shimmers or duochromes or shimmers with like multicolored sparkles, but like the quality of their shimmers has come a long way since like the Muse era. Like in the Muse era, the shimmers are not my favorite. I mostly use them to do shade cascades, but the shimmers in here I would use as standalone shimmers. They are very pretty. Moving on to a couple of palettes from Kryptein Cosmetics. This is their newest release for fall. This is their Emerald City palette, and as you can probably guess from the title and the cover, this is a pretty green heavy palette. I actually feel like this would really complement Cosmic Brushes Undergrowth because it is obviously smaller, so there isn't as much of a range of matte tones, and in this palette, it doesn't have any of those warm tones. It has mostly like those murky green tones, but there are also some cool tones that are lacking in Undergrowth. And then the thing with Kryptein palettes is, for the most part, I think all of their palettes have an equal number of mattes and shimmers, and a lot of their shimmers are special shimmers. So they are multi-chromes or super high shine and like reflective and textured and sparkly. And so, you know how I was saying with Undergrowth, Undergrowth, I found myself wishing that there were more green shimmers or just more special shimmers, I would absolutely pair this with Undergrowth and just have like my perfect assortment of shades. The shimmers in Kryptein palettes are always just incredible, and I really, really love like some of these are very unique. Like this shade over here is like electric with that like lime green base and just like the shifts and everything. Like look at how gorgeous that is. This one over here is a stunning spicy neutral with a bunch of multicolored sparkles. Very, very beautiful. From far away it looks like that, but then up close, if I can get it to go a little out of focus, it's not really going out of focus, but it does have a bunch of multicolored sparkles in it. This shade over here is not as shifty, but it is very sparkly and a gorgeous grungy green type of shimmer for fall time. And just like this whole palette is just so, so stunning. And as much as I talk about the shimmers from Kryptein being incredible, their matte formula is also really great. They're one of the brands that I kind of have like in my head where both their shimmer and matte formula are top tier. And I don't find myself wishing that they would change the formulas in any way. Like I'm always happy whenever I use one of their palettes. The other palette from Kryptein that I want to talk about was their first release ever. This is the Burnt Forest palette, and this has really stood the test of time because this color story is still so beautiful to me. I will say, you know, I'm not like the biggest fan of like this really light bone colored matte and like a black matte, but I do understand for this being their first ever palette, they probably needed to include those things to make it just like a well-rounded palette. And aside from that, I do really like the selection of tones over here. Like this neutral matte is so interesting because it has like a slightly yellow olive undertone. Like this is such a perfect transition shade for someone of my skin tone. And I love that you have mattes that have some like serious depth to them to add like contrast in the palette. And this shade of green as well is like quite unique. I feel like this type of green is not very common. And of course, like the shimmers are beautiful. I do think that their shimmers have improved since this palette because this palette has like a couple of duochromes that I have similar shades of, you know, and like this one over here is more of a standard shimmer. So these ones are more of like the special multi-chromes, and this one is a very unique shimmer, but I don't find them to be lacking in any way, like in terms of quality and sparkle and shine. They are very, very pretty, but I think they've come out with more like unique standout shimmers in their more recent palettes. But like as a color story, I'm still drawn to this palette. I still keep it in my top drawer and reach for it from time to time. And I think it was just a solid release from the brand. I don't know if this is currently available. I know that they had plans to restock it in the past. I don't know if it's still around or still available, but if it is, I still think it is a solid palette from the brand. And also one that kind of walks the line between neutral and colorful, like wearable and punchy. So like, I think it can satisfy, or it can create a lot of different kinds of looks. The last two palettes that I'm going to talk about are from Unearthly, starting with Fall Magic, which came out a couple years ago, I want to say. And like, obviously it has fall in the name. This was made for fall, but I actually feel like it's a bit of a, you know, interesting take on fall. Oh, I'm missing a matte. Let me go grab that. This was in a custom palette somewhere and I had to go dig around for it, but I have it now. The reason I feel like this is an interesting take for a fall palette is because you do have some like classic fall tones over here, but I feel like this pink over here and this cool tone brown are not tones you usually see in fall palettes, at least at the time. And that paired with like the shimmer selection over here just made this such a like pretty unique and interesting fall palette for its time. And it wasn't even like that old, but I also feel like this was around the time that Unearthly seriously leveled up their shimmer formula, because prior to this palette I'd heard such like mixed things about their shimmers being kind of like lackluster, hard panning, being a little squishy, and all of those things. And then this palette launched around the same time as Sorcerer's Smoke, and both of these palettes have just some of the most spectacular shimmers I've seen, and they're so beautiful and dimensional, sparkly, while still being very smooth. Like none of these have like a crazy amount of texture, but they have so much sparkle and shine to them. I also think that the shimmers in this palette really complement the mattes, and you have like a good range of tone, depth, and all of that. You have this iridescent over here that's like really pretty and sparkly and honestly like a little bit cool tone, but it would still go with a lot of these mattes. This one over here is gorgeous, a classic like green gold shimmer for fall. This one over here is probably the most textured shimmer in the palette, but it still smooths out and it's like very, very pretty and has like quite a sheer base, so you can layer it over some of the mattes. I actually used this in a look quite recently, a few days ago, and I was reminded how much I love it. This one over here I really love because it has like a gray base, but then it shifts to that pink and gold. So it kind of reminds me of Cleona's Forge, if you're familiar with that, but Forge has such a dark base. It's black based, and it's like, it also creases on me, which like none of the other Cleona shimmers crease on me, and shimmers in general don't really crease on me, so I much prefer this that's on a gray base over Forge that is on a black base and creases on me. Unfortunately, I don't think this palette is currently available. I don't know if the brand has plans to restock it, and even if they do, I'm not sure if it'll be available in this format because they recently restocked, I think it was Not Normal, and it came out in slightly smaller pan sizes. And these pans are quite large, but a couple of recent palettes had smaller pan sizes, so I just, I don't know if this will restock, and when it does, just, be aware of that. Last but not least is Unearthly's Just a Taste palette, which came out last year, and it's like very much a vampire themed palette, as you can see, and the inside really reflects that too. You have like these gorgeous fiery red tones, but to me this is another like quintessential fall palette that has like your like more warm tones, but like you do have some cool tones over here that are also really interesting. Now this palette, in contrast to Fall Magic, not all of the shimmers are that super special high shine, sparkly, dimensional type of shimmer. You do have some that are more like even satin-like, or just like, yeah, these two are more satiny, I would say. This is more of like a standard shimmer. Same with this one over here. Some of them are more like duochrome-y. Like, I feel like there aren't as many true multi-chromes in this palette, but I feel like that makes sense because this is a larger palette, and if it was packed full of multi-chromes, it would be so pricey. So I think it makes sense, and I also don't mind there being some like less sparkly, more satiny shimmers if you have ones that are also more textured to like layer with them, play with them, like make different kinds of looks. And also for me personally, I have other Unearthly palettes, other high shine texture shimmers to pair with this palette if that's what I want to do. I also really love the matte selection in this palette. Again, like I said previously, there aren't too many super light shades, which I really like. I love that you can make some like dramatic, murky, vampire-esque type of looks using this palette, because that's definitely what it's meant to do. And yeah, I just feel like this is such an interesting color story that fits the fall vibe, but is like a little bit of like a unique take on it, and fills a place in my collection, like fills a spot in my collection that isn't filled by other palettes, if that makes sense, because I keep this in my top drawer and I do reach for it quite a bit for some of the more unique tones in here. That is it for this video. I'm going to keep the outro short because all of my like palette roundup videos or palette ranking videos tend to be on the longer side, so I don't want to keep you here any longer than I need to, but do let me know what you thought of this video, this format, and whether I mentioned any of your favorite palettes for fall, or if you have any favorites that I did not mention in this video, because I am palette eyeshadow obsessed, and I always love to hear what other people enjoy. As always, thank you so much for watching till the end. It really does help out my channel, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!